Thessaloniki, in the 1880s, was a city where empires came to fray at the edges. The Ottoman port sprawled along the Aegean coast, its harbour crowded with ships carrying tobacco and grain to markets across the Mediterranean. Minarets rose beside church steeples. Greek merchants argued prices in the bazaars, while Jewish traders, descendants of families expelled from Spain 4 centuries before, conducted business in Ladino, their own blend of medieval Spanish and Hebrew. Turkish officials administered a population that included Bulgarians, Albanians, Armenians, and the mysterious Dunme, descendants of Jewish converts to Islam who maintained their own hidden traditions. 5 languages could be heard in a single street. The city was a mosaic of peoples held together by Ottoman authority that was visibly, unmistakably crumbling. Into this world, in the winter of 1881, a boy was born who would one day destroy the empire that governed it and build something entirely new from the wreckage. His parents named him simply Mustafa. His father, Ali Rıza Effendi, was a minor customs official who had tried his hand at the timber trade with limited success, a man of modest means and modest ambitions, literate and somewhat progressive by the standards of his community, but never destined for prominence. His mother, Zübeyde Hanım, was devout, strong-willed, and fiercely protective of her children, in an era when childhood illness carried away so many. Of her 6 children, only Mustafa and a sister would survive to adulthood. The Ottoman Empire, into which Mustafa was born, had been dying for longer than anyone could remember. Europeans called it the sick man of Europe, and the diagnosis was accurate, even if the patient refused to accept it. Territory that had once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf was shrinking with each passing decade. Greece had broken away, then Serbia, then Romania. Egypt was Ottoman, in name only. The Balkans seethed with nationalist movements that the imperial government could neither suppress nor satisfy. The great powers, Britain, France, Russia, Austria-Hungary, circled like physicians around a wealthy patient, less interested in cure than in inheritance. Mustafa's childhood was shaped by loss. When he was 7 years old, his father died, leaving Zübeyde to raise her surviving children alone. She retreated to her brother's farm in the countryside, a period of rural exile that young Mustafa remembered with distaste. He was a city boy, curious about the world beyond village horizons, impatient with the rhythms of agricultural life. When the family eventually returned to Thessaloniki, he carried with him a determination to escape the limitations that poverty and provincialism imposed. Education offered the path forward, but which education? His mother, devout and traditional, enrolled him first in a neighborhood religious school, the Mahalle Mektep, where children memorized Quranic verses and learned the basics of reading and writing in the old way. Mustafa found it stifling. The rote learning, the emphasis on tradition over inquiry, the narrow horizons of religious education, none of it satisfied a mind that was already reaching for something different. He transferred to the Shemsi Effendi School, a private institution that represented the other current flowing through late Ottoman society. Secular, modern, Western-influenced education that emphasized mathematics, science, and rational inquiry alongside traditional subjects. The contrast between the two schools crystallized something in young Mustafa's thinking. There were 2 paths available to the Ottoman world, one looking backward to religious tradition, one looking forward to European modernity, and he knew instinctively which path he preferred. At 12, he made a decision that would determine the course of his life. He would become a soldier. The military in the late Ottoman Empire was one of the few institutions where merit could triumph over birth, where a boy from a modest family might rise to prominence through ability and discipline. The army had also become a hotbed of reformist thinking. Officers who had studied European military science brought back not just tactics, but ideas about governance, nationalism, and the modern state. A military career meant education, opportunity, and exposure to the currents of thought that were reshaping the world. Mustafa enrolled in the military secondary school in Thessaloniki in 1893. He was 12 years old, slight for his age, with pale eyes and a serious demeanor that set him apart from his classmates. The school imposed discipline that some boys resented, but that Mustafa embraced: uniforms, schedules, hierarchies, the subordination of individual impulse to collective purpose. He excelled at mathematics, demonstrating an analytical precision that impressed his instructors. One of those instructors, a mathematics teacher who shared his first name, gave him the additional name that would follow him into history. Kemal, the teacher called him, a word meaning perfection or maturity, a recognition that this student was somehow different from the others, marked for distinction. Mustafa Kemal. The name fit. He would spend his life pursuing a vision of perfection for a nation that did not yet exist. In 1896, he advanced to the military high school in Monastir, deeper in the Macedonian interior, where the Ottoman hold on the Balkans was even more visibly contested. Here he encountered ideas that went beyond military science: nationalism, constitutionalism, the writings of European philosophers who argued that peoples had the right to govern themselves. The young Ottoman movement had planted seeds of reform decades earlier. Now those seeds were sprouting into more radical growth. Students whispered about revolution, about constitutions, about sweeping away the autocracy of Sultan Abdulhamid II and building something modern in its place. Mustafa listened, absorbed, and said little. He was learning not just what to think, but how to think, analytically, strategically, with the patience to wait for the right moment, rather than rushing into premature action. The empire around him was failing, that much was obvious. The question was, what would replace it, and who would do the replacing? He watched Thessaloniki, the city of his birth, slip further into chaos. Greek nationalists, Bulgarian revolutionaries, Ottoman loyalists, and agents of the great powers all competed for influence in a region that seemed ready to explode. The Macedonia of his youth was a laboratory of nationalism, demonstrating both its power to mobilize populations and its capacity to tear communities apart. He saw neighbors who had lived together for generations transformed into enemies by ideologies that insisted they belonged to different nations with incompatible destinies. The lesson sank deep. Nationalism could build, but it could also destroy. The question was how to harness its energy without being consumed by its violence, how to create a nation that was defined not by religious community or imperial loyalty, but by something new, something that could hold together in a world where empires were dying and peoples were demanding sovereignty. By 1899, Mustafa Kemal was 18 years old, ready to leave Monastir for the war college in Istanbul. He was no longer a child, but not yet a man. His ideas still forming, his ambitions still undefined. He knew he wanted to matter, wanted to shape events rather than merely suffer them, wanted to be part of whatever came next. He did not yet know what that would be. He only knew that the empire he served was dying, and that someone would have to build what came after. He intended to be ready when that moment arrived. Istanbul overwhelmed him. The imperial capital spread across its hills and waterways like a city from legend. Mosques and palaces, ancient walls and teeming bazaars. The Golden Horn glittering beneath minarets that had defined the skyline for 4 centuries. This was the heart of the Ottoman world, seat of the Sultan Caliph, who claimed authority over Muslims from Morocco to Indonesia, center of an empire that had once made Europe tremble. Mustafa Kemal arrived at the War College in 1899 as a provincial cadet from Thessaloniki, and the city's grandeur announced both the empire's past greatness and its present decay. The harbour, the Ottoman War College, was supposed to produce officers loyal to the Sultan and the dynasty. Instead, it had become a breeding ground for dissent. Young men who studied European military science could not help but notice the gap between what modern states achieved and what the Ottoman government delivered. They read forbidden books, discussed forbidden ideas, and formed secret societies dedicated to reform or revolution. The autocracy of Sultan Abdulhamid II, who had suspended the constitution, dissolved parliament, and ruled through censorship and a network of spies, generated opposition precisely among the educated elite the empire needed most. Mustafa Kemal joined these circles carefully, watching more than speaking, assessing who could be trusted and who might inform. He was learning the habits of conspiracy that would serve him later: discretion, patience, the ability to maintain a calm exterior while calculating furiously beneath. He graduated from the War College in 1902 and proceeded to the Staff College, the institution that trained the Ottoman military's future leaders. In 1905, he emerged as a staff captain, one of the youngest officers to achieve that rank, his career trajectory pointing toward distinction. His first posting sent him to Damascus, to the Fifth Army, responsible for Syria and Palestine. The assignment was meant as punishment. He had been caught participating in an underground society, but it became an education. He saw the empire's Arab provinces firsthand, the administrative dysfunction, the simmering resentments of populations who felt ruled rather than represented. He founded a new secret organization, Vatan ve Hurriyet, Fatherland and Freedom, dedicated to constitutional reform. The group attracted a handful of followers, but accomplished little. Mustafa Kemal was learning that conspiracy alone could not change systems. Power required organization on a scale he could not yet command. In 1907, he was transferred to Macedonia, back to the region of his birth, where a different revolutionary movement was gathering strength. The Committee of Union and Progress, known in the West as the Young Turks, had built a network of officers and officials determined to force constitutional government on the Sultan. Mustafa Kemal merged his small organization into theirs, becoming one figure among many in a movement that was rapidly approaching critical mass. The revolution came in July 1908. Army units in Macedonia mutinied, demanding restoration of the constitution Abdulhamid had suspended 3 decades before. The Sultan, faced with the choice of civil war or capitulation, chose to yield. The constitution was restored. Parliament was reconvened. The empire erupted in celebration, Christians and Muslims embracing in the streets, decades of autocracy seemingly swept away in days. It was the most hopeful moment the Ottoman Empire had experienced in a generation. Mustafa Kemal watched the celebrations with more reserve than joy. He had supported the revolution, but harbored doubts about its leaders. The Committee of Union and Progress was dominated by men whose ambitions and methods he distrusted, particularly Enver Pasha, a charismatic officer who was emerging as the movement's most visible figure. Enver was everything Mustafa Kemal was not: flamboyant, impulsive, eager for glory, certain of his own genius. The two men recognized each other as rivals from the beginning, their mutual antipathy shaping Ottoman politics for the next decade. The constitutional era lurched from crisis to crisis. Abdulhamid, attempted a counter-revolution in 1909 and was deposed, replaced by a pliant brother. The committee consolidated power but proved better at conspiracy than governance. The empire continued losing territory. Bosnia annexed by Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria declaring full independence, Crete uniting with Greece. The revolution had changed who ruled, but not the fundamental dynamics of imperial decline. In 1911, Italy invaded Libya, the last Ottoman territory in North Africa. Mustafa Kemal volunteered for service, travelling clandestinely through Egypt, officially neutral British territory, to reach the front. For nearly a year, he fought a guerrilla campaign against Italian forces around Tobruk and Derna, demonstrating the tactical skills and personal courage that would later make him famous. The Libyan campaign was hopeless. Italian naval superiority made reinforcement impossible, and the war ended with Ottoman surrender. But it taught Mustafa Kemal how determined resistance could extract costs from a superior enemy. He was still in Libya when worse news arrived. The Balkan Wars had begun. In October 1912, a coalition of Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro attacked the Ottoman Empire simultaneously, seeking to drive the Turks from Europe entirely. The Ottoman armies, poorly led and worse supplied, collapsed within weeks. Territory that had been Ottoman for 5 centuries fell in a single campaign. Mustafa Kemal rushed back from Libya to find his homeland transformed. Thessaloniki, the city of his birth, was now Greek. The cosmopolitan port where he had grown up, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews had lived together under Ottoman rule, had passed forever beyond Ottoman reach. His childhood home was now foreign territory. The loss was personal as much as political, a reminder that empires could vanish, that what seemed permanent could disappear within a single season of war. He served in the brief Second Balkan War, helping to recover Edirne, Adrianople, from Bulgaria. But the damage was done. The Ottoman Empire in Europe had been reduced to a small corner of Thrace, barely enough to protect Istanbul itself. The losses radicalized politics in the capital, strengthening the hand of those who argued that only aggressive nationalism could save what remained. By 1913, the Committee of Union and Progress had effectively become a military dictatorship, dominated by a triumvirate of pashas, Enver, Talat, and Cemal. Mustafa Kemal found himself marginalized, his criticisms of Enver's leadership unwelcome, his warnings about the direction of Ottoman policy ignored. He was assigned as military attaché to Sofia, the Bulgarian capital, an honorable exile that removed him from the center of power, while his rivals consolidated their grip on the state. He spent his time in Sofia, observing, reading, and refining his ideas about what a modern nation required. The European states he studied had something the Ottoman Empire lacked: a coherent national identity that bound citizens to their government through shared language, culture, and purpose, rather than through dynastic or religious loyalty. The empire had tried to accommodate diversity. Perhaps the future lay in defining a single nation, Turkish, modern, unified, that could survive where the empire had failed. These were dangerous thoughts, pointing toward conclusions that Mustafa Kemal was not yet ready to articulate, even to himself. The Ottoman Empire still existed, still commanded his loyalty as an officer, still represented the only political framework he had ever known. But he was beginning to imagine alternatives. In June 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne in Sarajevo. Within weeks, the great powers were at war. The conflict that would become known as the First World War had begun, and the Ottoman Empire led by Enver Pasha over Mustafa Kemal's objections, was about to join it. The empire he served was walking into a catastrophe, and Mustafa Kemal, still a relatively obscure staff officer, could do nothing but watch as the men he distrusted led his country toward destruction. The Ottoman Empire entered the war in October 1914, and everything Mustafa Kemal had feared began to unfold. Enver Pasha, now Minister of War and the dominant figure in Ottoman politics, had allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary against Britain, France, and Russia. He dreamed of glory, of recovering lost territories, of leading a pan-Turkic empire stretching from the Balkans to Central Asia. His first major campaign, a winter offensive against Russia in the Caucasus, ended in catastrophe at Sarıkamış. 90,000 Ottoman soldiers died, most of them freezing to death in mountain passes, victims of Enver's grandiose ambitions and incompetent planning. Mustafa Kemal watched from the margins, still in Sofia when the war began, then assigned to organize a new division that seemed unlikely to see significant action. He was 33 years old, talented, ambitious, and utterly sidelined while lesser men led the empire into disaster. Then the British came to Gallipoli. The Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, had been the key to Constantinople for millennia. Whoever controlled the strait controlled access to the Black Sea and, with it, the ability to supply Russia or strangle the Ottoman capital. In early 1915, the British and French conceived a plan to force the strait with naval power, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and open a supply route to their Russian allies. The naval assault in March failed. Ottoman mines and shore batteries savaged the Allied fleet, sinking several battleships and forcing a withdrawal. But the Allies did not abandon the campaign. They would try again with ground troops, landing soldiers on the Gallipoli Peninsula to seize the heights that commanded the strait. If they succeeded, Constantinople would fall, the Ottoman Empire would collapse, and the war might end years early. The landings came on April 25th, 1915. British, Australian, New Zealand, and French forces stormed ashore at multiple points along the peninsula, seeking to establish beachheads from which they could advance inland and capture the high ground. The Ottoman defenders, caught partially by surprise, struggled to contain the assault. Mustafa Kemal commanded the 19th Division, positioned in reserve behind the beaches where the Anzacs, Australian and New Zealand troops were landing. When reports reached him that the invaders were pushing inland toward the heights of Chunuk Bair, he did not wait for orders from his superiors. He gathered his men and marched toward the sound of fighting, arriving at the critical ridge just as Ottoman forces there were beginning to break. What happened next became legend. Mustafa Kemal found soldiers retreating, their ammunition exhausted, their officers dead or missing. He demanded to know why they were running. "We have no bullets," they told him. "If you haven't got ammunition, you have your bayonets," he replied, and ordered them to fix bayonets and lie down facing the enemy. The sight of a line of soldiers suddenly appearing on the ridge, apparently preparing to charge, made the advancing Anzacs hesitate, and that hesitation was enough. Reinforcements arrived. The line held. The heights remained in Ottoman hands. He issued an order that day that would echo through Turkish history. "I am not ordering you to attack. I am ordering you to die. In the time that passes until we die, other troops and commanders can come and take our places." It was not rhetoric. Mustafa Kemal was offering his own life alongside his soldiers, sharing the risk he demanded they accept. He was wounded by shrapnel that struck his pocket watch. The watch stopped the fragment from piercing his heart and continued commanding. His presence at the front, visible and calm, while shells exploded around him, inspired men to hold positions they would otherwise have abandoned. The Gallipoli campaign lasted 8 months. The Allies poured in reinforcements, launched offensive after offensive, and never broke through. Mustafa Kemal fought in the critical sectors, at Chunuk Bair, at Anafartala, wherever the situation was most desperate and leadership most needed. He was promoted to colonel, then given command of an entire corps. His reputation grew with each engagement until he was recognized as the architect of Ottoman victory at Gallipoli, the man who had saved Constantinople from capture. In January 1916, the Allies evacuated. They had lost over 200,000 casualties without achieving any of their objectives. The Ottoman defenders had lost nearly as many, but they had held. The strait remained closed, Russia remained isolated, and Constantinople remained Ottoman. It was the empire's greatest military success of the war, and everyone knew whose leadership had made it possible. For the first time, Mustafa Kemal was famous. Newspapers printed his name. The public celebrated him as a hero. But the glory was bittersweet. The empire was still losing, still bleeding on multiple fronts, still led by men whose judgment he distrusted. Gallipoli had been a defensive victory, buying time rather than changing the war's trajectory. The underlying catastrophe continued. He served on the Caucasus front, then in Syria, watching the empire contract around him. The Arab revolt, encouraged and supplied by the British, stripped away provinces that had been Ottoman for centuries. Baghdad fell, then Jerusalem, then Damascus. The German alliance that Enver had championed delivered weapons and advisors, but could not reverse the tide of defeat. By 1918, the Ottoman army was disintegrating, its soldiers starving and deserting, its officers struggling to maintain any semblance of order. Mustafa Kemal commanded forces in Syria during the final campaigns, serving under the German general Liman von Sanders. He conducted a fighting retreat that preserved his units when other formations collapsed entirely, demonstrating the same tactical skill and personal leadership that had distinguished him at Gallipoli. But retreat was all anyone could manage. The empire was dying, and no amount of individual brilliance could save it. The armistice of Mudros came on October 30th, 1918. The Ottoman Empire surrendered, accepting terms that left it prostrate before the victorious Allies. British warships steamed through the Dardanelles, the strait that Mustafa Kemal had defended, and anchored off Constantinople. Allied troops occupied the capital. The Sultan remained on his throne, but his authority extended only as far as the Allied commanders permitted. Mustafa Kemal returned to Constantinople to find it transformed into a city of occupation. Allied soldiers patrolled the streets. Allied flags flew from buildings. The Ottoman government still functioned after a fashion, but everyone understood that real power lay with the foreigners who had defeated them. The humiliation was quiet but absolute. An empire that had endured for 6 centuries, reduced to begging its conquerors for mercy. The victors were already discussing how to divide the spoils. Greece wanted the Aegean coast and Thrace. Italy wanted southwestern Anatolia. France wanted the southeast. Britain wanted control of the straits and influence everywhere else. Armenia would receive eastern provinces, where Armenians had once been numerous before the wartime deportations and massacres. The Ottoman heartland, Anatolia, the Turkish-speaking core of the empire, might be left nominally independent, but it would be a rump state, surrounded by territories carved away for others, too weak to resist any demands the powers chose to impose. The Sultan's government, exhausted and demoralized, seemed prepared to accept whatever terms were offered. Resistance appeared hopeless. The army was shattered, the economy ruined, the population decimated by years of war and disease. The men who had led the empire into catastrophe, Enver, Talat, Kemal, had fled abroad, leaving others to face the consequences of their failures. Mustafa Kemal looked at the occupied capital, at the foreign warships in the harbour, at the government that was ready to surrender everything, and made a decision. He would not accept it. On May 19th, 1919, a steamship carried Mustafa Kemal across the Black Sea to the port of Samsun. His official mission was to oversee the demobilization of Ottoman forces in eastern Anatolia and restore order to a region troubled by ethnic tensions between Turks and Greeks. The Sultan's government, under Allied pressure, wanted the army disbanded and resistance prevented. They sent Mustafa Kemal because he was competent and because he seemed, at that moment, cooperative enough to be trusted. They misjudged him entirely. Within days of landing at Samsun, Mustafa Kemal began doing the opposite of what he had been sent to do. Instead of demobilizing forces, he contacted nationalist officers throughout Anatolia, urging them to resist disarmament. Instead of accepting the occupation, he began organizing opposition. The government in Constantinople had sent him to pacify the interior. He would use the interior to defy the government. He moved inland, away from the coast where Allied warships could reach, into the Anatolian heartland, where the mountains and distances offered protection. At Amasya, in June, he issued a circular declaring that the nation's independence was in danger, that the government in Constantinople could not protect it, and that only the people themselves, organized and determined, could save Turkey from dismemberment. It was, in effect, a declaration of rebellion against both the occupation and the Ottoman government that collaborated with it. Congresses followed, gatherings of local notables, military officers, and nationalist activists who came together to coordinate resistance. At Erzurum, in July, representatives from the eastern provinces declared that Turkish territory must not be divided, that no foreign mandate would be accepted, and that a national assembly should be convened to speak for the people. At Sivas, in September, delegates from across Anatolia endorsed similar principles, creating a representative committee with Mustafa Kemal at its head. A shadow government was taking shape, its authority based not on dynastic succession or imperial tradition, but on the claim to represent the national will. The Sultan's government oscillated between accommodation and opposition. Some officials sympathized with the nationalists. Others denounced them as rebels and traitors. The Allies pressured Constantinople to suppress the movement, and the government dutifully issued orders for Mustafa Kemal's arrest. The orders were ignored. In Anatolia, his authority was growing while the Sultan's was evaporating. In April 1920, Mustafa Kemal convened the Grand National Assembly in Ankara, a dusty provincial town in the center of Anatolia, as far from Constantinople and Allied warships as he could manage. The choice was deliberate. Ankara would become the capital of a new Turkey, symbolically breaking with the imperial past, rooted in the Anatolian soil rather than the cosmopolitan waters of the Bosphorus. The assembly claimed sovereignty over Turkish lands and declared itself the legitimate government of the nation. There were now two governments, one in occupied Constantinople, subservient to the Allies, one in Ankara, defiant and determined. The Treaty of Sèvres, imposed on the Constantinople government in August 1920, confirmed everything the nationalists feared. The Ottoman Empire was dismembered on paper. Greece received Thrace and a zone around Smyrna. Armenia received eastern provinces. Kurdistan was promised autonomy. Italy and France received spheres of influence. The straits were internationalized. What remained of Turkey would be a landlocked rump, economically dependent, militarily impotent, sovereign in name only. The Constantinople government signed. The Ankara government declared the treaty void. The Greeks did not wait for signatures to enforce their claims. They had landed at Smyrna in May 1919, welcomed by the local Greek population, and began expanding their zone of control deep into Anatolia. Their ambition was the Megali idea, the great idea of resurrecting a Greek empire on both sides of the Aegean, with Constantinople itself eventually restored to Christian rule. The Greek army advanced inland, well-equipped, confident, backed by British support. Mustafa Kemal faced them with forces that barely deserved to be called an army. His soldiers were often irregulars, poorly armed, short on ammunition, lacking the heavy weapons and logistical support that modern warfare required. What they had was leadership that understood how to trade space for time, how to wear down an enemy far from his bases, how to exploit the vast distances of Anatolia. The war seesawed through 1920 and into 1921. Turkish forces won some engagements, lost others, retreated when they had to, counterattacked when they could. The Greeks pushed deeper into Anatolia, reaching toward Ankara itself, threatening to crush the nationalist movement before it could consolidate. In August 1921, they launched their greatest offensive, aiming to break through the Turkish lines along the Sakarya River and capture the capital. The Battle of Sakarya lasted 22 days. Mustafa Kemal commanded personally, the assembly having granted him emergency powers as commander-in-chief. He was everywhere, at the front lines, in planning sessions, making decisions that could not wait for committees. He ordered his forces to hold at all costs, to die in place rather than retreat further. "There is no line of defense," he reportedly said. "There is only a line of soldiers. That line is the entire fatherland." The Greek offensive broke against Turkish resistance. Casualties on both sides were enormous, but the Greeks could not sustain their losses so far from their bases. They fell back, their momentum exhausted, their supply lines overstretched. The tide had turned. For a year, the front stabilized, while both sides gathered strength. Mustafa Kemal used the time to build a real army, trained, equipped, organized along modern lines. He secured weapons and ammunition from Soviet Russia, whose Bolshevik government was happy to support anyone opposing the British-backed international order. He cultivated diplomatic relationships that isolated Greece from its former patrons. He waited, patient as always, for the moment when he could strike decisively. That moment came in August 1922. The Great Offensive caught the Greek army unprepared. Turkish forces broke through their lines, then exploited the breakthrough with a speed that turned retreat into rout. The Greek army collapsed, its units disintegrating, its soldiers fleeing toward the coast. Within weeks, Turkish forces had reached Smyrna, the city Greeks called Izmir, and reclaimed the Aegean coast. The Greek population fled in terror, boarding any ship that would take them, ending 3,000 years of Greek presence on the Anatolian shore. Smyrna burned in the aftermath, a catastrophic fire that destroyed much of the city and killed thousands. Who started it remains disputed. The consequences were not. The war ended not with reconciliation, but with population exchange. Greeks expelled from Anatolia, Turks expelled from Greece. Communities that had lived together for centuries, separated by the brutal logic of nationalism that recognized no room for minorities. The armistice of Mudanya in October 1922 ended the fighting. The Allies, unwilling to fight Turkey themselves, pressured Greece to accept defeat. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed in July 1923, replaced the hated Treaty of Sèvres with terms that recognized Turkish sovereignty over Anatolia, eastern Thrace, and the Straits. Foreign troops would leave. Capitulations, the special privileges that had allowed European powers to dominate Ottoman commerce and law, were abolished. Turkey would be independent, unified, sovereign. Mustafa Kemal had achieved what no one had believed possible. He had taken a defeated empire, organized resistance from nothing, built an army, defeated a European enemy, and forced the great powers to recognize a new nation's right to exist. He was 41 years old, and he had won the war that created modern Turkey. Now came the harder task, deciding what that Turkey would become. The Sultan still sat in Constantinople. Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman emperor, had collaborated with the Allies throughout the occupation, hoping that submission would preserve his throne. He had condemned the nationalists as rebels, issued death sentences against their leaders, and prayed that foreign support would save his dynasty from the consequences of its own failures. Now the foreigners were leaving, the nationalists had won, and the Sultan faced a reckoning. Mustafa Kemal moved with characteristic precision. On November 1st, 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara voted to abolish the Ottoman Sultanate. The motion separated the religious office of caliph, the symbolic leader of Sunni Islam, from the political office of sultan, eliminating the latter while temporarily preserving the former. It was a constitutional revolution disguised as a technicality, ending 6 centuries of Ottoman rule with a parliamentary vote. Mehmed VI fled Constantinople 2 weeks later, smuggled aboard a British warship, dying in exile 4 years later in San Remo. The dynasty that had conquered Constantinople built an empire spanning 3 continents and ruled for longer than any other Muslim royal house was finished. A cousin was appointed caliph, but everyone understood the position was now hollow, a transitional arrangement that would not survive long. The Sultanate's abolition cleared the way for something entirely new. On October 29th, 1923, the Grand National Assembly proclaimed the Republic of Turkey, with Mustafa Kemal as its first president. The declaration was almost anticlimactic, a formal recognition of what had already become reality. But its symbolic weight was immense. For the first time in Turkish history, sovereignty resided not in a dynasty, but in the nation itself, expressed through elected representatives rather than inherited by blood. Ankara became the capital, confirming the break with the imperial past. Constantinople, soon to be renamed Istanbul, remained the largest city, the commercial hub, the cultural center. But political power would reside in the Anatolian heartland, in a city that had been a provincial backwater until the nationalists made it their headquarters. The choice was deliberate. The new Turkey would not be a continuation of the Ottoman Empire, but something fundamentally different, rooted in different soil, oriented toward different horizons. Mustafa Kemal consolidated his authority with the same methodical intensity he had brought to the independence war. Political opposition existed, former allies who disagreed with his direction, religious conservatives who feared secular reform, regional leaders who preferred autonomy to centralization. But he marginalized or eliminated them one by one. The Progressive Republican Party, formed in 1924 by critics within the nationalist movement, was banned within a year. The assembly remained, elections continued, but real power concentrated in Mustafa Kemal's hands and those of his loyal followers in the Republican People's Party. The caliphate lasted only months longer than the sultanate. On March 3rd, 1924, The assembly voted to abolish it entirely, expelling the remaining members of the Ottoman dynasty from Turkey. The decision was explosive. The Caliph was, in theory, the spiritual leader of Muslims worldwide, and his removal generated outrage from India to Egypt. Mustafa Kemal calculated that the outrage would fade while the benefits would endure. He was building a secular nation-state, and a religious office that claimed authority over all Muslims was incompatible with that vision. He married that same year. Latif Ushaki was educated, westernized. The daughter of a wealthy merchant family from Smyrna, everything that the new Turkey was supposed to represent. She appeared beside him at public events, unveiled, speaking foreign languages, a visible symbol of the modern Turkish woman he wanted to create. The marriage lasted barely 2 years before ending in divorce, the reasons never publicly explained. Mustafa Kemal would have no children, no heir, no dynasty to continue his work. The Republic would have to sustain itself without him. Religious institutions that had shaped Ottoman society for centuries were systematically dismantled. The office of Sheikh-ul-Islam, the empire's supreme religious authority, was abolished. Religious courts that had administered family law according to Islamic principles were eliminated. The madrasis, religious schools that had educated Ottoman elites for generations, were closed. Their students transferred to secular institutions. Sufi orders, the mystical brotherhoods that had provided spiritual community for millions, were banned, their lodges shuttered, their practices driven underground. The reforms generated resistance. In 1925, a Kurdish rebellion led by Sheikh Said erupted in the southeast, combining religious grievance with ethnic nationalism. Mustafa Kemal crushed it ruthlessly. Martial law, military tribunals, mass executions of rebel leaders. He used the emergency to tighten control further, passing laws that restricted press freedom and political opposition. The Republic would be modern, secular, and unified. Those who disagreed would be silenced. Education became the foundation of the new order. Schools would teach Turkish nationalism, scientific reasoning, and loyalty to the Republic rather than religious tradition, imperial nostalgia, or regional identity. Teachers became agents of transformation, spreading the values of the new state into every village and town. A generation of children would grow up knowing nothing but the Republic, their minds shaped by curricula designed to produce citizens rather than subjects. The legal system was rebuilt from scratch. The Swiss Civil Code replaced Islamic family law, giving women equal rights in marriage, divorce, and inheritance. The Italian Penal Code replaced Ottoman criminal law. The German Commercial Code governed business transactions. Turkey adopted wholesale the legal frameworks that had taken European nations centuries to develop, compressing generations of legal evolution into a few years of revolutionary legislation. It was transformation by decree, imposed from above by a state that claimed to know what the nation needed better than the nation itself. Mustafa Kemal did not ask permission. He did not build consensus through gradual persuasion. He commanded, and the state obeyed, and those who resisted were crushed. The methods were authoritarian, but the goals were modernization. A nation that could stand as an equal among the powers that had nearly destroyed it, never again vulnerable to the weakness that had cost the empire everything. By the end of 1925, the foundations were laid. The sultanate and caliphate were gone. The republic was established. The legal system was being rebuilt. Education was being transformed. Religious authority was being broken. Turkey was becoming something that had never existed before, a secular nationalist state carved from the wreckage of an Islamic empire. But Mustafa Kemal was not finished. The changes so far had been institutional, laws and offices and formal structures. He intended to change the people themselves. The hat came first. In 1925, Mustafa Kemal appeared in public, wearing a Western-style Panama hat, a deliberate provocation in a society where headwear announced religious and social identity. The fez, the brimless cap that Ottoman men had worn for a century, was itself once a modernizing reform. Now it symbolized the old order that Mustafa Kemal was determined to destroy. He gave speeches praising civilized dress, mocking those who clung to traditional clothing, making clear which direction the nation would move. Then came the law. The hat law of 1925 banned the fez and required men to wear Western-style hats with brims. The requirement seems trivial. What difference could headwear make? But in a society where the fez marked a man as Muslim and modern in the Ottoman sense, the change was revolutionary. Religious conservatives who refused to comply faced fines and imprisonment. Some were executed. A hat became a loyalty test, a visible declaration of which Turkey a man belonged to. Clothing reform extended further. Mustafa Kemal encouraged, though did not legally mandate, Western dress for women, praising those who abandoned the veil, appearing at public events with women in European fashions. The message was consistent. Turkey would look like Europe, dress like Europe, present itself to the world as a nation that had left the East behind. Language posed a deeper challenge. Ottoman Turkish was written in Arabic script, its vocabulary heavy with Arabic and Persian borrowings, its mastery requiring years of education that most Turks never received. The script was beautiful but impractical, ill-suited to Turkish sounds, difficult to learn, a barrier between the educated elite and the mass of the population. Mustafa Kemal decided to tear it out by the roots. In 1928, the Latin alphabet became mandatory. Overnight, a nation that had written in Arabic script for 6 centuries was required to switch to Roman letters. Schools that had taught the old script now taught the new. Books, newspapers, government documents, street signs, everything had to be converted. Adults who had spent decades mastering Ottoman literacy found themselves suddenly illiterate, their hard-won skills rendered obsolete by presidential decree. Mustafa Kemal threw himself into the campaign personally. He traveled the country with a blackboard, teaching the new letters to crowds in town squares, demonstrating that even the president was a student of the new writing. The spectacle was propaganda, of course. The president as teacher, leading his people towards civilization. But it was also genuine. He believed in what he was doing, believed that the Latin alphabet would connect Turkey to the modern world while severing it from its Ottoman past. The language reforms went deeper than script. Committees worked to purge Turkish of Arabic and Persian vocabulary, replacing foreign borrowings with words revived from old Turkic sources or invented from native roots. The goal was a pure Turkish, cleansed of imperial contamination, expressing a national identity that owed nothing to the Islamic civilization the Ottomans had embraced. The project was never fully successful. Too much Arabic and Persian was too deeply embedded, but it transformed the language nonetheless, creating a gulf between modern Turkish and the Ottoman Turkish of just a generation before. Women's lives changed dramatically. The secular legal codes had already granted formal equality in marriage and divorce, but Mustafa Kemal pushed further. Women were encouraged to enter professions that had been closed to them: law, medicine, academia, government. In 1930, women gained the right to vote in municipal elections. In 1934, they received full suffrage and the right to hold national office. Turkey granted women political rights before France, before Italy, before many nations that considered themselves more advanced. The reforms reached into every corner of daily life. The Islamic calendar gave way to the Gregorian calendar. The Islamic day of rest, Friday, was replaced by the European Sunday. Metric measurements replaced traditional Ottoman units. Even time itself was standardized, the call to prayer no longer marking the hours as it had for centuries. In 1934, the surname law required every Turkish citizen to adopt a family name, a practice common in Europe but foreign to Ottoman tradition, where people were known by given names, patronymics, and titles. Mustafa Kemal was presented with a surname by the Grand National Assembly, Atatürk, father of the Turks. The name was legally unique to him, forbidden to anyone else, marking him as the singular founder of the nation. He accepted it, and Mustafa Kemal became Kemal Atatürk, the name by which history would remember him. He codified the ideology driving these changes into 6 principles, the 6 arrows that defined Kemalism and remain the official ideology of the Turkish state. Republicanism. Sovereignty belongs to the nation, not dynasties. Nationalism. Turkey is for Turks, defined by citizenship rather than religion. Populism. The state serves the people, not elites. Statism. The government directs economic development. Secularism. Religion is separate from public life. Reformism. Continuous progress toward modern civilization. These principles adorned public buildings, appeared in school books, and structured political discourse for generations. The transformation was real but incomplete. In the cities, westernization took hold. Educated Turks dressed in European fashion, spoke the purified language, embraced the secular calendar and the Latin script. In the villages where most Turks still lived, the changes penetrated unevenly. Peasants might wear Western hats because the law required it, while maintaining traditional practices in everything else. The gap between the westernized elite and the traditional masses, a gap the reforms were supposed to close, sometimes widened instead. Ataturk governed through the Republican People's Party, which held a monopoly on political power throughout his presidency. Opposition parties were banned or marginalized. The press operated under censorship. Critics were silenced, sometimes imprisoned, occasionally executed. He experimented briefly with allowing opposition, twice permitting alternative parties to form, but shut them down. When they attracted support, he found threatening. The Republic was democratic in form, but authoritarian in practice, its liberties conditional on acceptance of the Kemalist program. His personal life remained austere despite his absolute power. He never remarried after his divorce from Latif. He adopted several children, daughters mostly, whom he educated as models of the new Turkish woman, but formed no lasting romantic attachments. He worked obsessively, sleeping little, reading constantly, drafting speeches and legislation late into the night. He drank heavily, a habit that would eventually destroy his health, seeking perhaps in alcohol the relief from tension that nothing else provided. Peace at home, peace in the world, became his foreign policy doctrine. Having won independence through war, he rejected further territorial ambitions, seeking instead stable borders and recognition from the international community. Turkey joined the League of Nations, signed treaties of friendship with former enemies, and positioned itself as a reliable partner rather than a revisionist power. The aggressive nationalism that drove the independence struggle transformed into a defensive nationalism focused on consolidating rather than expanding. By the mid-1930s, The revolution had achieved a kind of stability. The institutions were established, the reforms implemented, the opposition suppressed, the nation, at least officially, transformed. Turkey was recognized as a sovereign state, its independence secure, its modernization impressive by any measure. Atatürk had accomplished what he set out to accomplish, but his body was failing. The decades of war and stress, the relentless work schedule, the alcohol that had become his constant companion, all of it was taking its toll. The father of the Turks was dying, and he knew it. The diagnosis was cirrhosis of the liver. Years of heavy drinking had destroyed the organ that even his iron will could not command. By 1937, the symptoms were unmistakable: fatigue, jaundice, fluid accumulation in his abdomen. Doctors prescribed rest, but Atatürk had never learned to rest. He continued working, continued appearing at public functions, continued directing the state he had created, even as his strength visibly ebbed. Those who saw him in his final years noticed the yellowing skin, the gaunt features, the exhaustion that no amount of determination could fully conceal. He spent his last months at Dolmabahce Palace in Istanbul, the ornate Ottoman residence on the Bosphorus where sultans had once held court. The choice was ironic. The man who had moved the capital to Ankara, who had broken with the imperial past in every way he could devise, returned to the palace of the dynasty he had destroyed to await his death. Perhaps he wanted to be near the water, near the city that remained Turkey's cultural heart, despite losing its political primacy. Perhaps he simply wanted to die somewhere beautiful. He remained lucid almost to the end, receiving visitors, discussing politics, issuing instructions to the government that would have to continue without him. He had no heir, no designated successor, no dynasty to preserve his vision. The Republic would have to sustain itself through institutions rather than bloodlines, exactly as he had intended, but also a source of anxiety as his condition worsened. Would the system he built survive the founder's death? Would his successors preserve what he had created or allow it to decay? On November 10th, 1938, at 9:05 in the morning, Kemal Atatürk died. He was 57 years old. The clocks at Dolmabahce Palace were stopped at the moment of his death and remain frozen at 9:05 to this day, a gesture of mourning that has become a permanent memorial. Time itself suspended in tribute to the man who had tried to drag his nation into a new era. Throughout Turkey, sirens wailed, flags dropped to half-staff, and millions of people who had never met him wept in the streets. Whatever criticisms might be leveled at his methods, the grief was genuine. He had saved them from dismemberment, given them a nation, transformed their world. Now he was gone. İsmet İnönü, his closest ally through the Independence War and the years of reform, became the second president of the Republic. The transition was smooth. No succession crisis, no civil war, no collapse of the state into the chaos that had consumed so many revolutionary regimes when their founders died. The institutions Atatürk had built held firm. The army remained loyal to the Republic rather than to any individual. The single-party system continued to function, providing continuity even as the irreplaceable leader was replaced. They buried him first in a temporary tomb in Ankara, then began construction of a monument worthy of his memory. Anıtkabir, the memorial tomb, took 15 years to complete, a massive mausoleum complex on a hill overlooking the capital. The architecture blended ancient Anatolian motifs with modernist simplicity, announcing that Turkey's roots ran deep while its face looked forward. His remains were transferred there in 1953, and Anıtkabir became a site of national pilgrimage. visited by millions who come to pay respects to the founder. His image multiplied across the nation. Statues rose in every city, every town square, every public space that mattered. His portrait hung in government offices, in schools, in shops and homes. His signature appeared on banknotes. His words were carved into monuments and memorized by schoolchildren. Laws were passed, making it a crime to insult his memory. Laws that remain in force today, protecting his reputation with the power of the state he created. The cult of Atatürk that emerged after his death was partly genuine veneration, partly deliberate construction. The state needed a unifying symbol, a figure around whom national identity could coalesce, and Atatürk served that purpose perfectly. He became less a historical person than a national icon, his complexities smoothed away, his failures minimized, his achievements magnified into myth. The man who had drunk himself to death became a model of discipline. The authoritarian who had crushed opposition became a champion of progress. The human being disappeared into the monument. What remains when the monument is examined critically? He destroyed an empire and built a nation in its place. The Ottoman state that had governed Anatolia and beyond for 6 centuries was finished. Not merely defeated, but abolished. Its institutions dismantled, its ruling family exiled, its very memory officially repudiated. In its place rose something that had never existed, a Turkish nation-state, defined by language and citizenship rather than religion and dynasty, secular in its foundations, nationalist in its ideology, determined to be European in its orientation. He saved Anatolia from partition. When he landed at Samsun in 1919, the treaty powers planned to divide Turkish-speaking lands among Greeks, Armenians, Italians, French, and British-backed zones. By the time he died, Turkey controlled more territory than the treaties had allotted, its sovereignty recognized, its borders secure, its independence unchallenged. Whatever else might be said about his methods, the nation he led survived when survival seemed impossible. He transformed Turkish society more rapidly and more thoroughly than almost any leader in modern history. The alphabet, the legal system, the calendar, the clothing, the role of women, the relationship between religion and state, all of it changed within a single generation. Imposed from above by a government that believed it knew what modernity required and refused to wait for popular opinion to catch up. The Turkey of 1938 was unrecognizable compared to the Ottoman society of 1918. Nothing like that transformation had occurred anywhere else in so short a time. He did it through methods that cannot be called democratic. Single-party rule, press censorship, political prisoners, executions of opponents, suppression of minorities, forced cultural change. These were the tools he employed, and no honest accounting can ignore them. He believed that the Turkish people needed to be saved from themselves, that their attachment to tradition was an obstacle to survival, that a firm hand was necessary to drag them into the modern world, whether they wished to go or not. The results were impressive. The means were authoritarian. The debates continue. Turkish secularists revere him as the founder of everything they value: the separation of religion from state, the emancipation of women, the orientation toward Europe and the West. Turkish Islamists resent him as the destroyer of a civilization, the man who severed Turkey from its Ottoman and Islamic heritage, who closed the mosques and banned the brotherhoods and tried to make Turks ashamed of their own history. Kurds remember the suppression of their identity, the insistence that everyone within Turkey's borders was Turkish, regardless of language or culture. Each group sees a different Atatürk, and each has evidence to support its view. He would not have been surprised by the controversy. He knew he was forcing change on people who did not always want it. He believed the change was necessary, that without it, Turkey would have shared the fate of other post-Ottoman territories, divided and dominated by foreign powers, too weak to control its own destiny. Whether he was right, whether gentler methods might have achieved similar results, whether the costs were worth the benefits, these are questions that history cannot definitively answer. It can only record what happened and let the living draw their own conclusions. What is beyond dispute is that Turkey exists because of him, the nation that emerged from the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire, that fought off dismemberment, that transformed itself into a modern state, that remains today a significant power in a troubled region. That nation is his creation. Other leaders contributed, other factors mattered, but no one shaped modern Turkey more than the man who gave it his name. Ankara stands where he placed it, the capital of a republic he proclaimed, its government buildings and monuments testifying to the vision he imposed. Istanbul endures as it has endured for 2 millennia, no longer the seat of empire, but still the heart of the nation, its minarets and bridges spanning Europe and Asia as they always have. Between them, across the Anatolian plateau, he defended with an army of volunteers and irregulars. 70 million Turks live in a country that bears his imprint in ways most of them no longer consciously notice. Every morning, in schools across Turkey, children recite an oath that begins, "I am a Turk, I am honest, I am hard-working." They stand before his portrait, under his gaze, inheriting an identity he defined for them before they were born. Whether they accept that inheritance gratefully or question it critically, they cannot escape it. He made them what they are. The clocks at Dolmabahce still show 9:05. Time stopped when he died, or so the memorial pretends. But time did not stop. Turkey continued without him. Through World War and Cold War, through coups and crises, through economic transformation and political upheaval. The nation he built proved stronger than any individual, surviving challenges that might have destroyed a state dependent on its founder's personal authority. That, perhaps, was his greatest achievement, not the reforms, not the military victories, not the transformation of society, but the creation of something that could outlast him. He built a nation where there had been only an empire's wreckage. He gave that nation institutions that functioned after he was gone. He planted an identity that took root and grew. At dawn, the sun rises over Ankara, casting long shadows across the city that an empire's collapse made capital. The mausoleum on the hill catches the first light, white stone gleaming above the government buildings and apartment blocks that spread across the plateau. Somewhere in the city, a flag rises. Somewhere, a portrait looks down from a wall. Somewhere, a child learns the name that every Turkish child learns, the father who gave them a country. Atatürk, father of the Turks. The republic stands where an empire once ruled. The end.